There's been some great presentations this morning about the wide range of data we can use to inform policy on levelling up. Some really interesting perspectives on what to measure. But I will argue that in answering the question, what to measure, we need to better understand why we're measuring it. What is the context for the data that we're gathering? And I'll argue how by taking a long-run view of the evidence and the data through looking at structural trends, through use of scenarios and a theory of change approach, we can use evidence to better inform how policy and intervention can make a difference on the levelling up agenda. We'll be familiar with many of the problems with the existing data and the way in which data is used. It's predominantly lag, not lead indicators, and sometimes it lags by several years. It tells us what has happened, and what the impact of changes have been, not what is happening and what might make a difference. And that's exacerbated by a predominant focus amongst policymakers on cross-sectional evidence, the evidence on where places are at now, what are the current conditions, not a longitudinal approach, which is looking at some of the long-run structural trends that are impinging on places and what might be a plausible or desirable set of scenarios and forecasts for how places might develop and change in the future. There are also problems which you'll be familiar with around spatial scale, how that interacts with administrative boundaries. Some places are underbounded, some places are generously bounded. SIC codes and our traditional definitions of sectors are not good at capturing the dynamism and the reality of the modern economy. There's also a risk of comparing apples with pears. Different places have different aspirations. Different places have different realistic prospects for their future development and growth. And I think there is a real danger of us using a league table approach to compare places that aren't really comparable. And finally, collecting data, analysing it is all very well, but it's important we answer the so what question. Why are we collecting it? What difference can it make? And how can it be used to better define policy? We've developed at ARUP through work we've done with the 101 towns that have benefited from the Stronger Towns programme, the concept of a golden thread to inform their town investment plans. And that is set out in this slide. It starts by taking a look back at how the economy of a place, how its demography, how its environment has changed over time. What have been the drivers for those changes? What have been the causal factors? Why are they where they are? And that has been used through a SWOT approach to identify the current position and an understanding of market failures. We've worked with towns to then look forward to consider future scenarios through different lenses, societal, how will people live their lives differently? What will be the impact of increasingly rapid technological change? How's the economy likely to change and affect their place? What about the environment and the drive towards net zero? And what are some of the political dynamics and the realpolitik in providing the context within which a town is moving forward? And this use of scenarios can be really valuable in helping inform a vision for a place that strikes the right balance between ambition and realism, and that helping define and illustrate a case for change. All of that can flow through into a business case for investment programs and individual projects through setting of clear and sensible objectives, through assessing options against those objectives, for having a theory of change. What are the levers that policymakers can pull, and how do we think they can make a difference? And in understanding what the benefits of interventions will be and how those benefits can be maximised and realised. And I think it's really important that when we think about evidence and we think about data, we think about this wider context in terms of how policies, strategies and programmes are developed. And scenarios can be really, really powerful. Scenarios aren't predictions, they aren't forecasts, they are hypothetical but plausible frameworks for descriptions of how the future may develop. They are internally consistent, so they identify the chains of cause and effect, and they can be very powerful in getting people to think about the future in a different way, challenging a sort of business as usual narrative or mindset, and considering the benefits and risks of different policy and investment options. So in an increasingly uncertain world, an increasingly complex world where places are undergoing rapid change, looking at scenarios, making sure they're informed by what's happened in the past, but also informed by the levers that policymakers can pull, can be very powerful and can help cut through some of that complexity to provide some sort of clarity and insight. So that's the approach we would advocate. I just want to touch on three specific issues now before I sum up. First, I think we've got to recognise that when we're looking at levelling up, we've got to understand that places are different, with very different strengths and very different positions in terms of the level of competitive advantage they can take. I know that's something Paul Swinney from Centre for Cities has been talking about. And by way of illustration, this list is also derived from our work on the Towns Fund. And it just identifies some of the different working groups we've put together of those 101 towns. And it sets out how there are very different characteristics, very different types of assets, and very different relationships with the wider economy across the different towns. And I think it's really important when considering data and considering which data to collect and how to compare the relative performance and progress of places, that we recognise they're in different starting points and they may have different aspirations and different ambitions. And I think that is perfectly appropriate and actually a good thing. And therefore, I would guard against seeking uniformity through a sort of league table approach when we're dealing with places that really are very different. Secondly, I wanted to talk briefly on the ecosystem for developing more innovation-led growth and more entrepreneurial-led growth. We'll be very aware, including from the discussions this morning, about the importance of investment in research and development, and the way that investment is not spread evenly currently, as Tom Forth and Richard Jones have shown through the Missing 4 Billion work. But as Neil O'Brien has argued, we've also got to focus on the D, not just the R, and we've got to think about the ecosystem, about how innovation, investment in innovation, and how research can be commercialized. How can we get that commercial pull through into the real economy, into real businesses, whether they're existing businesses or new startups and scale-ups. I've been involved in the Leeds City region team that has undertaken MIT's Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Programme. MIT have developed this stakeholder model of the different actors that are needed for a dynamic, innovation-led economic ecosystem. We may argue whether it's the right model, but I think we would agree that successful economies have many of these features and have these stakeholders working in a coherent way that's more than the sum of the constituent parts. And I think this poses a really interesting question in terms of data. How can we get the data to understand the strength of this ecosystem? How are universities engaging with entrepreneurs? What sort of startups and scale-ups are we seeing? Are they genuinely innovation-driven businesses as opposed to consumption-driven businesses? What are the trends in terms of investment of risk capital and angel investment? What are the corporates doing through their collaborations? And what role can the government play? And so I put that out as a challenge for an area where I think we need more and better data. And also we could argue whether the focus here should be around specialization in particular sectors, as the CBI have argued, or whether what we really need is more diverse economies in the places that we're seeking to level up, which Centre for Cities have argued. I think my own view is economic diversity, particularly if it's related diversity, is a strength, and I would guard against going down an overly specialist route for places. And then the final issue I wanted to just flag is some of the thinking around a mission-orientated approach to innovation. Been doing some work recently in the Humber, where the Humber are facing significant challenges around the transition to net zero of a very carbon-intensive economy, challenges around resilience, around the effects of climate change, challenges around improving health and well-being through innovation and public policy. And the vision in the Humber is if we can address some of those challenges well in the Humber, that can create global competitive advantage in being able to export that expertise much more widely. So when thinking about some of the local challenges that have a global application, we should also be thinking about open data as a resource that innovators, that entrepreneurs, that government, that universities can draw on. And I think that this mission-orientated approach and the role data can play in it is really interesting and another interesting opportunity. So finally, I just want to draw out some of the implications of the revised Green Book that was revised last year. I think all of this has implications for how we use and collect data. The new Green Book places a much greater emphasis on the strategic case, on the importance of demonstrating how the strategic objectives of a proposal contribute to a broader vision and strategy for change. Investment decisions should be based on an assessment of those options against strategic objectives, not just narrowly through a BCR. The new Green Book also places greater emphasis on the distributional analysis of how investments will impact different people and places in different ways. And that logic chain, that golden thread I talked about earlier, is also emphasised in the Green Book. So I think using data and particularly open data can be really useful in many of these respects and can be put at the heart of good decision making around projects. So my final slide, 5 calls to action really. First, focus on why to measure things before deciding what to measure. And in doing so, don't equate quantity of measurement with quality of analysis. Secondly, take that longitudinal approach, look back at some of those long-run structural trends, and look forward to in developing scenarios that can be a really powerful tool. Third, use data to inform the development of a theory of change approach, to set out how interventions can really make a difference and what is the logic chain behind it. But in doing so, and in developing the strategic casebook projects, also understand the limits of at least quantitative data. The data is a really important tool. We need more and better data. We need more open data, but it is no substitute in its own right for good, sound policy making and judgment. And finally, think about evaluation from the outset, not as a bolt-on, as at the end. As we develop exciting new policy initiatives, programs and interventions to support levelling up, it's really important that we have good frameworks and the right data to understand the difference we're making and what's going to work well and maybe less well, and how we can learn from it. So I hope that's helpful. Better data clearly has a role to play in levelling up, but it's a means to an end, not an end in itself. And we also need it to inform the development of the vision, the leadership and determination to make a difference, so all parts of the UK can contribute to the national growth to the full potential. Thank you.